So if you're just joining us today and haven't been with us for a number of weeks, we've been in a series called Anchor Points. And it's basically a foundation from cover to cover of the Bible, important pieces of doctrinal information. That's a good reminder or a good refresher in some regards. And for some of us, this is completely new information. So we started out this series with apostolic epistemology. What is our worldview? How do we view the world through the lens of the Bible? Then we moved on to the authority of God's word. We established that if one piece of the book is true, the whole book is true. And through faith, which was our next topic, we lean into that and we trust God and we respond to his word. After that, we talked about the oneness of God. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. The foundation of everything for the doctrine. And today, I have been tasked with the gospel. And not just tasked with the gospel, but my job today is to prove that the gospel is not just a story, that it's not just pages in a book that have no meaning in and of themselves. Maybe it's true, maybe it's not, and that it has eternal value. And so if you'll bear with me today, we are going to spend most of the lesson proving that the gospel is true in every aspect, and then we'll move into that portion, the other portion there at the end. So the books Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they're not just a story, they were real people. The stories in them were real events that happened in real locations. And so today, as I said, we're going to set out to prove that. And so I thought, you know what, why don't we just make the case for the gospel today? And so why don't we take on the role of an investigator, of a detective today, and zero in on some things. And what investigators and detectives do, they interview witnesses and victims, they gather evidence, they question suspects, they make arrests, and when necessary, they testify in court. And so we won't be arresting anyone here today, praise the Lord, but we're going to take a look at some of these eyewitness accounts of the Gospels, because that's what they are. The Gospels are each of the four men who wrote the Gospels, they are telling the life of Jesus. It's their eyewitness account for what has gone on right before their eyes. And there are a lot of critics that would love to say and pinpoint and pick apart the Gospels and say that they are not what they say they are, and this couldn't have happened and that couldn't have happened. But we're going to take a look at things and see what really went on. So in the case for the gospel today, we're going to start by looking at the internal evidence, the evidence that we can actually find within the books of the Bible themselves to prove that they are true. Okay, and so in preparing for this message, I read some excerpts from a book. I want to let you know that up front, from an author called J. Warner Wallace, and he was a homicide detective for many years. He's a national speaker now. He's the author of the book Cold Case Christianity, and he's a former atheist. And he writes that in his line of work, when he's looking at eyewitness accounts to determine if they're true, they're really what they're saying is true, if they're reliable sources, he looks at four pieces of criteria. And so we're going to look at those four things today. Number one, he looks at the time in which the statements came forth. How close to the events are we seeing these stories come out? Now, that would be a little bit of a different time span when we're talking about the Bible, right, and entire books of the Bible being written. That would be a little bit different than, like, you know, your typical homicide case today, right? It would be a lot less. You would be looking for a witness to come forth very, very quickly. When you're talking about ancient texts, and this applies to all of the ancient texts written, not just the Bible, they're looking at how long did it take these people to write about it, because they want to know how early were they written, because the sooner the eyewitness account comes forth, it becomes available, the more likely it is accurate. Because not only do memories fade, but also as more time passes, it's less likely to find others that can prove or disprove what the person is saying. Okay, and so there is some debate. I'm going to tell you there are just pages and pages of documents and differing opinions on when exactly the first book of the gospel which was written, which was the book of Mark. There is some debate on what year exactly it came forth. Some will tell you it came probably late 40 AD to early 50 AD. Other scholars will try to push it off a little further. And so what I did, I just took a middle number. How about that? I took the most popular opinion because I'm not a historical scholar, and I cannot do that digging and find out exactly. So most scholars agree that the book of Mark was written in the vicinity of 60 AD, give or take a few years, okay? So Jesus was crucified. There's a couple different opinions on that, but they know it has to be basically either AD 30 or AD 33. Okay, so we're looking at 30 to 33 AD to 60 AD is when the first book of the Gospels was written, which to us, honestly, that kind of seemed like a little bit of a large period of time to me. But apparently, when you're talking about ancient texts, that's a very short period of time. It's actually remarkably short to anything else written during that time period and having actual historical documents to back them up. Most of the time in other texts, the span is hundreds to thousands even of years. And so at the time of the Gospels were written, there were many witnesses still living. The people that witnessed basically everything that has been written in the Gospels, other than Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they were still living when the book of Mark was written. Does that make sense? And so there was plenty of opportunity for them to come in and say, no, that didn't really happen. There was plenty of room for opposition to come forth because many people had stood there and witnessed what had happened. And so the fact that the gospel message continued to gain ground and spread across the world from there tells me that it was true. If there had been a lot of opposition, that thing wouldn't have gotten off the ground. Would you agree with me? Christianity itself would have crumbled right then and there, and if they hadn't been factual accounts. Okay, so there we've proven that the accounts were written early, and so there was plenty of time for them to come under scrutiny. Number two, J. Warner Wallace, when he's looking at eyewitness accounts, he's looking at them and saying, has this changed over time? He's looking for any little piece of information that wasn't, let's say, in the second statement, but it was in the first witness statement. Does that make sense? He's looking for any little discrepancy. And so this is another criteria used that can test the validity of eyewitness accounts. And typically investigators use the chain of custody to try to track that and make sure things haven't changed. And so this author, J. Warner Wallace, he says that he would begin tracing evidence from the first officer who reported it, to the detectives who next handled it, to the criminalists who then examined it in the lab, to the detectives who eventually delivered it into the courtroom, so he would know what each and every one of them had to say about the evidence under question. And so when we take a look, let's say at the Gospel of John, it can be traced from John himself to, he had 3 personal students. Next, the accounts were passed down to them. And then the 3 students had 1 student that they all invested in, and it was passed on to him. And so each of these men in the gospel chain of custody, if you will, wrote his own letters and documents describing what they had been taught by their predecessors. So John writes his book. His 3 students write their account of what John has told them, or maybe they were there. I'm not sure of their ages. It was very likely that they were also witnessing the life of Jesus. And so all of those accounts seem to back each other up. These letters survive to this day, and they allow us to evaluate whether or not that New Testament accounts have changed through the years. And so if you go beyond even just the single Gospel of John to the New Testament as a whole, There are well over 5,000 Greek manuscripts in existence today that include either a portion of all of the New Testament or the New Testament in its entirety. Over 5,000. No other ancient texts has even close to that. So I think that's pretty amazing. It's a very high number when you consider how long ago it was written. Only about 3 manuscripts exist of the works of one ancient historian from the same time period, and about 50 manuscripts exist from another. So you can see how huge that number is. These thousands of Greek manuscripts of the New Testament, they're all in complete agreement. Yes, there may be a little misspelling here or misspelling there, but these have been picked apart for the ages, and it has been proven over and over and over again that God's word is true. The next thing that investigators look at when they're reviewing eyewitness accounts is bias. They want to know, does this eyewitness have something to gain by going a certain way with their testimony? And this man, J. Warner Wallace, as I've already mentioned many times as author, in his many years of experience, he notes that a witness's motivation for lying always falls into one of 3 categories. Number 1, financial greed. Number 2, relational lust. Or number 3, the pursuit of power. He says that's it every time. It's one of the 3. So let's take a look at these 3 areas and determine if Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John could have provided false testimonies due to any of those 3 motivations. So we'll start with financial greed. Did Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John become rich due to the testimony accounts they provided in the Gospels? Absolutely not, right? It's laughable even that they could have become rich from this. In fact, these people gave up their day jobs, literally gave up their source of income to follow after Jesus. They gave up their entire livelihood, the things they had worked on for years and years and years. They gave it all up to carry the gospel literally across the globe. And so to even say that they lived financially humble lives, I feel like, is probably a great understatement if we really knew what was going on. So I think we can check financial greed off the list of a motivation for these men. Number 2, relational lust. Did Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John come into relationship with a bunch of girls due to the testimony accounts they provided in the Gospels? No. We'll just leave it at no. Number 3, the pursuit of power. Did Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John gain great authority in their communities due to the testimony accounts they provided in the Gospels? Right? You could kind of be like on the fence a little bit about that one if you think about it, but the report is that they didn't. Shocker. Right? You would think that these men would have received, the highest respect due. But as we know, they receive very little respect in their communities. It's so clear that their testimonies are free from motive and bias because these men of God, what they gained was a life of persecution, relentless persecution, brutal beatings, starvation, in extremely violent deaths. That's how their stories ended. That's what they received from sharing the truth of Jesus with others. J. Warner Wallace also writes that his investigative and trial experiences have taught him that all corroborative evidence is touch point evidence. And I'm going to give you an example of what he means by that. He states that eyewitness claims are typically corroborated by limited pieces of evidence verifying just a portion of the larger account. And so here is his example from his book. He says, imagine, for example, a witness testifies that a robbery suspect approached a bank teller, pointed a gun at her using his right hand, began to climb up onto the counter using his left hand, screamed at the teller, and demanded she give him the money from the cash drawer. Prosecutors may introduce fingerprint or shoe print evidence from the counter in an effort to corroborate the witness. If the fingerprints on the counter match the fingerprints from the suspect's left hand and the shoe print matches the suspect's shoe, the statement of the witness would be considered reliable and corroborated by the evidence, even though this corroborative evidence would tell us nothing about what the suspect screamed or whether or not he had a weapon. And so as we look through the Gospels, there is a vast abundance of what we'll call this touch point evidence in the Gospel accounts, and they verify the accuracy throughout all of the New Testament. So some of this corroboration is internal corroboration. It's internal evidence, like the points I've already mentioned today. Those are all internal evidence points. Other forms of internal evidence which would verify the validity of the Gospels are the Old Testament prophecies that were fulfilled through the lives of John the Baptist and Jesus himself. Still, other internal evidence would be the prophecies spoken by Jesus himself that came to pass while he was still on earth, but then also came to pass after he had his crucifixion death. Other touch point evidence of the truth of the Gospels can be found in external sources. And so we're going to move on to this external evidence, which will look at history and even some of archaeology. So one point of external evidence would be other early Christian writers that were not in the Bible. They had nothing to do with the writing of the Bible, but they were in existence at that same time, and they were Christian believers, and they wrote texts themselves. They based their faith on the truth of the Gospels as well. And when you look at their writings, and so they also risked their lives for faith. One man named Papias was a Christian writer and an acquaintance of John the Apostle. He wrote that John testified that the Gospel of Mark was based on Simon Peter's memories of Jesus' life and ministry. This is external evidence that the Gospel of Mark records an eyewitness account of Jesus' ministry. His account was the first external corroboration that is considered to be legitimate of the Gospel writers. Another man, Irenaeus, he was another Christian writer who proclaimed that the 4 books of the Gospel collectively and exclusively contained the truth. He was born around the year AD 125, less than 40 years after John wrote his gospel. Irenaeus wrote, "So firm is the ground upon which these gospels rest, that the very heretics themselves bear witness to them, and starting from these documents, each one of them endeavors to establish his own particular doctrine." I thought that quote was very interesting because when you begin to think about it, in Christianity, everybody seems to agree on the Gospels. He literally said it's the basis for every doctrine, right? And so everyone can seem to agree that the Gospels are true. Even according to this man, Irenaeus, he says that even the heretics of the early church respected the Gospel records. Another point of external evidence we can look at is the testimony of non-Christian writers. People who were not Christian, they didn't believe that Jesus was Christ. One, especially Josephus, supports many details of the gospel. In total, about a dozen ancient Jewish, Greek, and Roman writers mention Jesus. Altogether, their writings include detailed events from the life of Jesus, as well as other names and places in those accounts, corroborating many aspects of the gospel. Another point of external evidence is geographical accuracy. Scholars have been blown away at the Apostle Luke's accuracy. This man, his accounts are so detailed that really his writing has been the main touch point that that historians have been able to prove things off of. So as usual, historians would start with like, this book is untrue. So now let me go find ways that we can prove it to be true. Like, let's see if they exist. But until I find all of those things, this book isn't true. One man named Sir William Mitchell Ramsay, a 19th century English historian and prolific writer, held a pervasive anti-biblical bias. He believed the historical accounts in the book of Acts were written in the mid-2nd century. We're talking hundreds of years after it was actually written. He was skeptical of Luke's authorship and the historicity. I can't even say that word. It's a quote, of course, that I'm reading. Historicity, I guess, is how we would say it, of the book of Acts. And how is it historically accurate is what it's trying to say. He set out to prove his suspicions, basically to disprove the entire gospel account. And so he began with a detailed study of archaeological evidence. And he eventually became very surprised at his findings. The historical and archaeological evidence supported that Luke's first century authorship was indeed true and that his accounts were historically reliable. Here's his quote. He says, "There are reasons for placing the author of Acts among the historians of the first rank." That's quite the turn, quite the 180 there. He was originally saying, these people don't know what they're talking about. This is all a farce. And after he studies this out, a historian very well known across the world at this time, his conclusion is that Luke, while he was a physician, right, by trade, we know that originally he was a doctor. Apparently, the man writes like a historian. Ramsey became convinced of Luke's reliability based on the accurate description of historical events and settings. Ramsey wasn't the only scholar to be impressed by Luke's accuracy. And I'm going to read you another quote here. "One of the most remarkable tokens of Luke's accuracy is his sure familiarity with the proper titles of all the notable persons who are mentioned." Would you believe the case for the gospel comes down to, in many regards, or at least initially, Luke's ability to get people's titles correct? That's what it came down to. Cyprus, for example, which was an imperial province until 22 BC, became a senatorial province in that year and was therefore governed no longer by an imperial, but by a proconsul. And so when Paul and Barnabas arrived in Cyprus about AD 47, it was the proconsul Sergius Paulus whom they met. And so Luke, when he details these people's titles, these other historians are coming back years later they're like, this isn't correct. That's not what the title is. Well, guess what they find out? A few years after Luke wrote this, the whole Roman government changed the way they organized the titles of people. It was impressive. Luke's narratives include detailed and specific descriptions related to the locations, people, offices, and titles with the Roman Empire. In fact, many of Luke's claims were eventually confirmed by even archaeological discoveries. Time and time again, Luke has been found to be unsurpassed in his knowledge of history and geography. Some of the locations in his writing were very obscure places, and they would have only been known even to local residents. Like one thing I was reading said, the Sea of Galilee was not actually called the Sea of Galilee to the known population. It was only called the Sea of Galilee to the people who lived there locally. It was called the Lake of Galilee. And so this man writes it as the Sea of Galilee, and it proves that he was there on site because only the locals know about these words. In every case that Ramsey tried to bring against the Gospel of Luke and many others that he studied, he'd found Luke's account to be accurate in every way, in every detail. Another piece of external evidence that we can look at is local customs. The local customs that were mentioned in the gospel accounts. This comes down to very, very minute details that have proven accuracy. We're going to take a look at just one of them today. Could you pull up Luke 7:11 through 15 for me? So this, again, it's just one little tiny account that seemingly, as you're reading through this in your Bible reading plan, doesn't really stop and make you think, this proves the legitimacy of the gospel. But let's read it. It says, soon afterward, or now I'm looking at a different translation. I'll read it from there. Now it happened the day after that he went into a city called Nain, and many of his disciples went with him, and a large crowd. We're talking about Jesus. When the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her and said to her, do not weep. Moving on to verse 14. Then he came and touched the open coffin. This was a funeral procession. And those who carried him stood still. And he said, young man, I say to you, arise. So he who was dead sat up and began to speak. And he presented him to his mother. Jesus presented the man who was dead, who is now alive, to his mother. So probably our first thinking is it's the miracle, right? It's the miracle. This dead man is now alive. The miracle proves it. That's not what proved it to the historians. Here is what they said. At the time of Christ, there were different customs with respect to women walking in a funeral procession. In Judea, the area around Jerusalem, the custom was for the women to walk behind the funeral procession. The casket led the way, with the women following behind. But in the Galilee region, the custom was reversed. The women walked in front of the funeral procession with the casket trailing behind. And so what that means is it was the women, the casket, and then all of the people, right? All of the loved ones. That's the procession. That is the order of the custom in Galilee. And that is what we exactly see in this scripture. So yet again, a very minute detail that we would just move on past proves this account to be true. Because Luke says that Jesus, he began to talk with mom first, right? He talked with mom, and then he touched the coffin. And at that time, it says the funeral procession stopped. Why did the funeral procession stop? Because mom stopped and the casket stopped. Does that make sense? And so it would have only been, this statement, this account would only be true if it was set in the Galilee region. And so if this story had unfolded in Judea, then it would have happened in reverse. And so historians say that this account, again, in a very minute detail, minute accuracy, proves it to be true. Here's another example. The details of the crucifixion recorded in the Gospels matches the customs used in Roman crucifixions during this time period. Now, that doesn't sound super mind-blowing to me, right? Because I know that the Gospels are true. So if that's how Jesus was crucified, I'm just like the others that were crucified along with him, looks like the custom to me, right? But again, if you're approaching from this, like, nothing is true until we find proof that it is. In 1968, they found the proof. The first remains of a crucifixion victim were found, and his ankles were still being held together by a nail at the time of discovery thousands of years later. So again, another thing that proves the customs that were going forth in the life of Jesus. Other external evidence we can look at, statues and coins. If we look at the family of the Caesars, there are a number of individuals who are mentioned in the New Testament whose likeness has been found on either statues or coins, and of course further proves the case of the gospel. The four Caesars that are mentioned in the New Testament, three of them are only mentioned by name, but they have found proof of all of them. Augustus, the Roman emperor who ruled from 27 BC to AD 14, was the emperor at the time Jesus was born, right? This account is in Luke 2:1. I'm not going to stop and read it. His image is found on many coins and statues. The Roman emperor Tiberius, AD 14 through 37, ruled during the time of Jesus' public ministry. This would be accounts found in Matthew 22:17, Mark 12:14 through 17, Luke 3:1, Luke 20:22 through 25, Luke 23:2, and John 19:12 and 15 all back this up. His likeness is also found on statues and coins. The Roman Emperor Claudius ruled from AD 41 to 54. He is the one who ordered the Jews to leave Rome. This is found in Acts 11:28, 17:7, 18:2. Okay, Book of Acts is obviously not technically included in the Gospels, but was written shortly after, and all the apostles make an appearance there. Coins and statues also bear this man's likeness. Nero, while he is not named in the Bible specifically, he's the Caesar to whom Paul appealed. He is referred to in the following places: Acts 25:11, 12, 21, 26, and 32, 28:19, Philippians 4:22. He reigned from AD 54 to 68, and his likeness also has been found on coins. Then we move to the family of the Herods. I'm just trying to get through this because I'm short on time, so bear with me if you feel like I'm flying. I think we understand at this point, but I'm just going to go ahead and finish the case if you don't mind. The Herods. There are a number of Herods mentioned in the New Testament. The evidence shows that they too were historical characters, real people. Herod the Great was ruling Judea at the time Jesus was born. This is mentioned in Matthew 2:1. He was the evil ruler who ordered the slaughter of the innocents at Bethlehem. His name has been found on coins. Herod Antipas, which was called Herod the Tetrarch in the New Testament. This is mentioned in Luke 3:1. Coins carry the inscription Herod the Tetrarch. There are also inscriptions on bronze coins which read Herod the Tetrarch to Gaius Caesar Germanicus. Herod Agrippa the first was ruler of Judea from AD 27 through 44. He's the one who persecuted many members of the early church. We found that all over the book of Acts. Coins have been found with the inscription, the great King Agrippa, friend of the Caesar. Herod Agrippa II, the son of Herod Agrippa, ruled the area of Galilee from AD 56 through 95. Paul appealed to him before going to Rome. Again, in the book of Acts, his likeness is found on coins to this day. Let's take a look at some houses and structures. Synagogues. A number of originally, it took quite a while, apparently, for them to unearth these synagogues. And so one kind of big thing critics were hanging their hat on for quite some time was, how did Jesus supposedly teach in all these synagogues if we can't find the existence of them? We can't find any proof. Well, they found it. A number of the first century synagogues have now been discovered, the ones in which Jesus specifically taught. Let's look at the Pool of Bethesda. John wrote about the existence of a Pool of Bethesda. This is John 5:1 through 9, and said that it was located in the region of Jerusalem near the Sheep Gate, surrounded by 5 porticos. In 1888, archaeologists began excavating the area near what is now St. Anne's Church, or at that time was St. Anne's Church in Jerusalem, and they discovered actually the remains of the pool itself, complete with steps leading down from one side and 5 shallow porticos on another side, exactly as John described. Centuries later, the Pool of Siloam. The Pool of Siloam, mentioned in John 9:1 through 12, as a place of ceremonial cleansing, was discovered by a team of archaeologists in the year 1880, just 8 years prior to the Pool of Bethesda. Yet more corroboration for the truth of the Gospels. Pilate's judgment seat. For years, the whole account of the crucifixion and everything, the accounts leading up to it, were said to be not true because they couldn't, here's the reason, they couldn't find evidence of Pilate's judgment seat. They couldn't find evidence, so all of it was untrue. For many years, there were questions about it, and actually even his title, Pontius Pilate, was a big area of debate. He was the Roman governor, as many of us know, who presided over the trial of Jesus. In later Roman writers, as well as almost all biblical reference works, Pilate is actually referred to as the procurator of Judea. According to the New Testament, though, he's called a governor, not a procurator, and so this was a big area of concern for many people. But in 1961, on the coast of Israel, in the town of Caesarea, the discovery was made of a 2 by 3 foot stone, 24 inches by 36-inch stone that had a Latin inscription written upon it. The translation of the inscription reads as follows: Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea, has presented the Tiberium to the Caesareans. So again, they couldn't figure it out, all the historians, right? Because they're looking here with this post-knowledge, and they're trying to disprove something, and they didn't realize that they had it wrong all along. This is the first archaeological evidence for the existence of Pilate. And what is interesting about the inscription, of course, is, as I mentioned, the title that he is given, prefect of Judea. So every jot and every tittle, basically, in the Gospels, down to the last minute title, has been proven. Additionally, John 19:13 refers to the judgment seat, as I mentioned, where Pilate sat while trying Jesus. They couldn't find any evidence of this. The scripture references, so when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat at a place called the stone pavement. They couldn't find the stone pavement. So for many years, liberal critics, they said the whole story was a myth because they couldn't find evidence of this small piece of stone. However, they have since found it, and it can be even seen by visitors to Jerusalem to this day. When the Roman general Titus destroyed Jerusalem, he built barracks above the pavement, apparently is what happened. And when these barracks crumbled, other buildings were built on top. And so essentially the pavement disappeared for some period of time. And so early archaeologists had dug down to the barracks many times, but they had always stopped. And so apparently this stone pavement was right under where they had dug. And so it was in the 1970s that they discovered this and proved this place of existence in the New Testament. This is my last one, my last bit of archaeological proof for you today, Caiaphas. In 1990, not that long ago, the bones of Caiaphas, the high priest involved in the crucifixion of Jesus, they were discovered. This was a mind-blowing discovery for archaeologists. They were discovered in basically what is considered to be a limestone burial box. I saw a picture of it. It probably sits this high, this wide, has a rounded lid on the top, and has all these very intricate engravings. They found it with the inscription of Caiaphas on the top. And it was buried with about 12 other burial boxes deep inside of a cave in Jerusalem. So basically, let's sum it all up here today. We've proven the case, I think, pretty well from archaeology, fulfilled prophecy. We've mentioned ancient statements of early non-Christian authors even. We have internal evidence of language, right? Proper title usage, cultural details. The New Testament Gospels are actually corroborated better than any other ancient text, and that is a fact. That is what historians will tell you. It's corroborated better than any other ancient text, period, is what they say. So there it is, irrefutable proof, evidence that every account given within the Gospels is true. But what does that mean for us today? We have all that knowledge, great. So for some of us, this information, if you're new to the church, this could have been revelatory information. This could have just changed your life because you were looking for proof and now you have it. For others, out of faith, you've believed that these books were true, right? And it wasn't going to take, this mountain of evidence for you. You honestly, you've just been maybe waiting for these archaeologists to catch up, right? You've been waiting for everybody else to catch up with this hardcore proof. But no matter where you stand, which camp you were in today, I want to remind you, whether it's the first time you've ever heard this or it's the 100th time, those books of the Bible have the power to change your life. If you would stand with me, I'm going to close. This truly is the message that changes lives. If you begin to read it and study it out, many miracles are mentioned throughout these books. It is really the core, right, of who Jesus was. Miracles are a big debate in the historical community because they can't seem to prove it. But many accounts of Jesus, again, outside of biblical texts, they agree that Jesus worked wonders. Their only debate was what spirit was behind it. And I find that pretty powerful. Another reason they can't seem to back up miracles, which is good, is because apparently miracles don't happen today, church. That's what these people say. But you know what? I think we're about ready to prove them wrong. What do you think?